During late 2019 and early 2020, the world saw a cataclysmic event that changed the lives of those living today. The COVID-19 pandemic swept through all parts of the world, touching every corner of the globe. Schools, businesses, and even recreational places were shut down to all people. The hardest hit during the pandemic was, of course, the hospitals and other medical facilities. No healthcare professional is without some type of COVID-19 story. Dr. David Gudis was working as a physician in New York City during the height of the pandemic. One day, while he was charged with overseeing the COVID community hotline, he spoke on the phone with a woman who he had never met. The 44-year-old woman had a history of pulmonary distress and was gasping for breath when she called the hotline. But despite the woman being in respiratory distress, she didn't want Dr. Gudis to send her an ambulance. Dr. Gudis explained that the situation was dire and that if he didn't call 911 on her behalf, she wouldn't likely make it. Her response? But they won't let my husband come with me, and I don't want to die alone. At that moment, things started to make perfect sense for the doctor. It's not that the patient did not want to be treated. It's that she didn't want to be alone if this were to be her final hours. Dr. Gudis told the woman on the phone that when he called for an ambulance, he would ask that they allow her husband to accompany her. As a result, she agreed to have an ambulance called for her. But when Dr. Gudis did that, he made no request on behalf of the woman's husband because he already knew that such requests would be futile given the paramedics' strict protocols during that time. Dr. Gudis was dishonest to the patient to protect her life from her fears. The preceding story shapes our discussion about three things about the lived experiences of having an illness. The first is patient's identity. The second is wrestling with self-presentation and impression management in medicine. And the final one is patient autonomy. As a brief roadmap, we'll be covering these ideas in the current video presentation for this week. What do you think about when you hear the word identity? Identity is a very important part of your being. According to Disraeli Cruz, your identity is your definition of yourself, and it encompasses how you see yourself as similar and different from others. You might be thinking to yourself that this sounds a lot like self-concept, which is the perception that we have of ourselves. The answer to the question, who am I, is a deep reflection on your identity, and various sources, including your preferences, habits, hobbies, skills, and other things add to that self-image. Identity is comprised mainly of personality factors, such as you identify yourself as a funny, warm, or caring person. Demographic factors, such as you're of a teen or adolescent age, a female, or of Hispanic descent. Group membership, such as do you belong to a sports team, academic club, or a Greek organization, and different roles you assume in life. Are you a manager, a parent, or a moderator of a virtual group? One thing that can affect your identity is illness, especially when that illness is chronic. Illnesses can change who we are across the various domains of our lives. Illnesses can envelop every fabric of our lives. Therefore, patients confronted with a serious illness often develop what's called a patient identity. There are four states that patients with chronic or ongoing illnesses might adopt in their definition of self. The first state is called rejection, where the patient has a refusal to see their illness as part of their identity. The refusal to see illness as part of one's identity can lead to choices that adversely affect his, her, or their health. For example, a diabetic who rejects the notion of integrating diabetes into their concept of self may refuse to follow exercise and better eating habits. The second state is called engulfment, where the patient becomes overwhelmed or preoccupied with the illness. These patients tend to ignore or overlook other parts of their identity and focus on their illness as a dominant part of self. Anxiety and depression can emerge for those who adopt an engulfment state. The third state is called acceptance. As the name suggests, accepting the illness as an unavoidable part of one's life is key to this identity state. The illness is neither wholly ignored, nor does it overwhelm the patient. Healthy adaptations to one's lifestyle as a function of the illness emerge for those who reach acceptance. Finally, enrichment involves the understanding that some good has come from the illness. It might not necessarily be physical changes, but it could be changes to one's psychology, such as enhanced feelings of strength and resilience. Those who are in an enrichment state are most likely to have the highest self-rated well-being scores. Now that we've talked about patient self-identity, let's turn our attention to how patients might project that identity to their healthcare providers and close others by introducing the topic of patient impression management or self-presentation. Erving Goffman was one of the first people to treat interpersonal interactions as a subject of legitimate communication study. Using theater performances as an allegory to everyday life, Goffman suggested that when people come into contact with others, they will attempt to control or guide the impressions others make of them by altering the setting of communication, their appearance, and manner in which they behave. Imagine the kinds of alterations that you make on a daily basis to attempt to control people's perceptions of you. Wearing an ironed shirt to a job interview, putting on perfume or cologne before going out, or even combing your hair or brushing your teeth before you go out constitutes some attempt at self-presentation. Here are some examples of when selective self-presentation or impression management in health-related communication might have implications on one's overall well-being. Take the case of condom use and risks of STIs. We know that sexual transmitted infections like HIV/AIDS, gonorrhea, syphilis, and chlamydia are still very prevalent in our world. In fact, the World Health Organization estimated that approximately 374 million STIs were contracted globally in 2020. Here in the US, a survey of sexually active high school students showed that they used condoms just over half the time when asked about their last sexual encounter. Despite our extensive knowledge that condoms can save lives by preventing some incurable diseases, they are not used consistently and completely. Part of the reason why condoms are used so inconsistently during sexual intercourse is because self-presentation. In various studies of college students, people self-reported that they may have had a condom on them, but were reluctant to produce or discuss them because they were concerned about the impression such conversations would generate in their partners. For example, men tended to worry about the underlying messages communicated when they produced the condom right before sex. They feared that their partner will think that they were calculating and cunning in planning this all along. Females, on the other hand, were reluctant to carry or produce condoms before sex, fearing that they would be perceived as very sexually experienced or even promiscuous. Accordingly, self-presentation served as an important barrier to the endorsement of preventative contraceptives during sex. Likewise, other impression management concerns were cited in some other populations. For example, in a study of gay men conducted by Gold and Associates in 1991, some men didn't discuss condoms because doing so would indicate that he isn't a quote-unquote real man willing to take risks. Likewise, others were concerned that merely bringing up condom use might indicate to the other that he already had an existing STI of which they needed to be cautious. Here's another example of selective self-presentation as it relates to health communication. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC in the US, reports that the percent of adults aged 18 and over who met the physical activities guideline for both aerobic and muscle strengthening activity was 24.2% in 2022. Indeed, there are very compelling reasons for why people go to the gym or work out at home for both aerobic and muscle strengthening activities. Part of that calculus is, of course, self-presentation. The desire to look good or aesthetics is in a way managing the impressions of others by indicating to them your desire to maintain your health. It seems obvious to us that at least for some, the desire to exercise and lift weights is in part about self-presentation. But did you ever consider the inverse? According to the World Health Organization, regular physical activity promotes both mental and physical health in people of all ages. Yet today, more than 80% of adolescents and 27% of adults do not meet the World Health Organization's recommended levels of physical activity. Hart and colleagues conducted a study of obesity, something I struggled with about 10 years ago when I reached about 300 pounds, and asked overweight individuals why they failed to exercise despite knowing that they ought to. The results were staggering. Impression managements of themselves as someone not worthy of going to the gym or would otherwise get laughed at was the primary reason why some chose not to exercise. So much so that some fitness trainers and sports psychologists have recommended including self-presentational awareness as part of wholeness training. The idea of patient autonomy is one that should be addressed when discussing patient identity. The story of Dr. Gudis at the beginning of this module video exemplifies the importance of the delicate balance healthcare professionals must make between their professional judgment and their patients' self-determination. Patient autonomy is a principle invoked in discussions of confidentiality, fidelity, privacy, and truth-telling. Patient autonomy is the idea that patients ought to make decisions that are intentional, with substantial understanding of the implications, and free from controlling influences. One question you might ask yourself about the opening story is whether the healthcare professional was ethical in his deception. Should healthcare professionals be able to withhold information or even manipulate information if they think it's in their patient's best interests? Two fundamental ideas come from the definition of patient autonomy. First, patients should be given various options available for their care and allowed to make voluntary choices about whether or not to administer any healthcare interventions. Second, patients should be enabled to make informed decisions that emphasize a fundamental understanding of the benefits and risks of any course of action. As it turns out, the idea of patient autonomy is not always so clear-cut in the world of biomedical ethics, especially when we consider patients' rights. Patients' rights are a subset of human rights. Patients' rights refer to a minimum standard for the way a patient should be treated by their various healthcare providers. At times, two of the fundamental patients' rights are pitted against each other. On one side is patient autonomy, and on the other is non-maleficence, or the oath doctors take to do no harm to their patients. Here's a personal example of when the two rights might conflict. In June of this year, my dad was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. He had an aggressive form of cancer called adenocarcinoma, which had metastasized to his spinal cord and to his brain. His prognosis wasn't good, but his oncologist had said that with radiation and chemotherapy, he might be able to prolong his life by years rather than by months. Last month, my dad had a bout of pneumonia after his second round of chemotherapy. He was put into the ICU, put on a ventilator, and my mom was given power to make his medical decisions for him based on an advanced healthcare directive they filled out long before news of the cancer. In the ICU, my mom, who didn't want to lose her husband of 4 decades, wanted the doctors to do everything they could to help my dad get over the pneumonia. The ICU attending physician and residents, on the other hand, took a little bit of a different approach, telling my mom that they'd like to do nothing further for him given his chronic underlying conditions and focus on comfort care. It became a daily struggle between encouraging the doctors to follow my mom's wishes, thereby looking out for my dad's autonomy, and receiving numerous messages from the doctors saying they'd like to end his care. The chief reason they cited from their position is that more healthcare interventions could be doing more harm to my dad than good, and the doctors took an oath to do no harm. One conversation that'll stick out in my mind forever is that my mom once asked the doctors if he's suffering from the different procedures used to keep him alive. And the doctors, without hesitation or really even full knowledge given my dad's unresponsive state, as he was put under heavy sedation, was an emphatic yes. Now, I'm not here to make the case that any one side was more right than the other, but I hope you can see from my personal example that healthcare providers and patients face moral and ethical dilemmas in healthcare all the time. That's pretty much all I have for this third module on patient identity and autonomy. In this module, you learned about self and how that identity that patients create for themselves manifests with their healthcare providers and close others. We reviewed the importance of understanding self-presentation and impression management as it relates to one's health. Recall that we talked about various examples wherein health outcomes can be affected by the way patients manage information about themselves. Finally, you learned about patient autonomy and how there can be different controversies in the way patients' rights are upheld by healthcare professionals. As usual, if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments of this video or feel free to email me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next week.